A single slap. That is literally all it took to completely rewrite the stars. When Sophie O'Connell threw her own body between a raging, drunk socialite and a frail, confused elderly woman, she figured she was just doing the decent thing. Sure, she assumed it would cost her catering job, but she had absolutely no clue that the trembling old woman she was shielding was the mother of Lorenzo Valente. Yes, that Lorenzo Valente, the most ruthless, untouchable crime boss on the entire East Coast. Sophie didn't just play hero that night. She accidentally lit the fuse on an all-out war. And the vengeance that came next? It wasn't just violent. It was biblical. The chandeliers inside the Van Veer estate didn't just sparkle, they practically screamed old money. Dazzling light refracted off thousands of crystal teardrops, painting dizzying little rainbows all over the hundreds of elite guests swarming the ballroom. But for Sophie O'Connell, that light wasn't magical. It was just a harsh spotlight on her bone-deep exhaustion. She nervously adjusted the stiff, scratchy collar of her catering uniform, her fingers trembling. She had been on her feet for 14 brutal hours. The agency-mandated heels were a full size too small, biting into her heels until her toes had gone completely numb. Still, she plastered on a fake smile. She had no choice. Her little brother, Toby, needed his insulin, and the rent on their crumbling Lower East Side apartment was 2 months past due. Getting fired tonight was simply not an option. Sophie stuck to the edges of the room, quietly gathering empty champagne flutes. That was when she spotted her. An elderly woman was aimlessly wandering near the towering seafood buffet. She stood out like a sore thumb, not because her clothes were cheap, but because they were so understated. She wore a modest, high-quality black dress that lacked the flashy, ostentatious vibe of the other billionaires. She looked completely disoriented, her white-knuckled hand tightly gripping a worn leather purse. Wisps of gray hair had escaped her severe bun, framing a face that looked terrifyingly lost. Sophie froze, watching her. The old woman shakily reached out for a tiny appetizer, but as she pulled her hand back, she accidentally bumped into a waiter rushing past. The waiter aggressively rebalanced his tray, shot the old woman a venomous glare, and stormed off. The woman physically shrank, pulling her shoulders up to her ears. "Excuse me," the old woman whispered to the empty air, her voice shaking. Sophie felt a sharp ache in her chest. She recognized that look instantly. It was the face of someone drowning in a room full of people who flat out refused to throw a life preserver. Suddenly, the crowd violently parted. Beatrice Van Veer was stomping toward the buffet, her fiancé Richard trailing a few steps behind her, scrolling on his phone and looking aggressively bored. Beatrice was clearly several drinks deep. Her cheeks were flushed, and her movements were dangerously erratic. "I specifically demanded the beluga caviar." Beatrice was practically yelling. "If this idiot caterer messed it up, I am nuking his Yelp page before midnight." She spun around sharply, totally blind to her surroundings. The collision was completely unavoidable. Beatrice slammed face first into the frail elderly woman. Crash. The massive glass of red wine Beatrice had been gripping splashed violently across the front of her pristine, ivory silk dress. The crystal goblet shattered against the marble floor. The entire ballroom went dead silent. Even the orchestra stopped mid-note. Beatrice stared down at the dark red stain ruining her gown, her jaw literally dropping. Then, her furious eyes snapped up to the old woman. The shock on Beatrice's face morphed instantly into pure, unhinged rage. "You clumsy old hag!" Beatrice shrieked, the insult echoing like a gunshot through the quiet room. The elderly woman began to violently tremble, throwing her fragile hand up defensively. I am so sorry, miss. I got turned around. I didn't see you." "You didn't see me?" Beatrice took a threatening step forward, her stilettos clicking like a ticking bomb. "Do you have any earthly idea what this is? This is custom Vera wine. It is worth more than your miserable life." Richard finally looked up from his phone, smirking slightly. Babe, let it go," he drawled, not making a single move to actually stop her. "No. Look at this creature. Beatrice waved frantically at the terrified woman. Who even let the help in here? She reeks of mothballs and poverty. Where the hell is security? Tears spilled over the old woman's wrinkled cheeks. She looked so small, so incredibly fragile. Please, she whimpered. I'm just looking for my son. I don't know where I am. I don't care about your stupid son. Beatrice lunged forward, viciously grabbing the old woman by her thin shoulder and shaking her. You ruined my night. Sophie didn't think. She didn't calculate the lost wages or the overdue rent. Her body simply moved. She dropped her silver tray. The heavy crystal flutes shattered loudly against the floor as she full-on sprinted across the gap. Beatrice had raised her hand. It was a terrifying, knee-jerk reflex of pure, unchecked privilege. She was winding up to slap the elderly woman across the face. Her palm was flat, her face twisted into a cruel snarl. No! Sophie screamed. She threw herself into the crossfire, wrapping her arms tightly around the old woman and spinning her back toward Beatrice just as the hand came swinging down. Crack! The slap landed flush against Sophie's cheekbone. It was a brutal hit. Beatrice was wearing a massive, jagged diamond engagement ring, and the sharp metal dug right into Sophie's skin, slicing it open. The sheer force of the blow snapped Sophie's head to the side and knocked the wind right out of her lungs. The silence in the ballroom grew so heavy you could choke on it. Sophie blinked rapidly, diately tasting the metallic tang of blood in her mouth. Her face felt like it had been pressed against a hot stove. But she didn't let go of the old woman. She just hugged her tighter, feeling the frail chest heaving against her own. Are you okay? Sophie whispered breathlessly. The old woman looked up, her dark eyes wide with utter shock. Child, she gasped. Sophie slowly turned to face the raging socialite. A thin stream of bright red blood trickled down her pale cheek. Despite the violent throbbing in her face and the adrenaline making her legs shake, she stood tall. She is an elderly woman, Sophie said, her voice shaking but cutting through the room like glass. She didn't mean to bump you. You were going to assault her. I can do whatever I damn well please, Beatrice hissed, her eyes narrowing into slits. I am a Vanveer. And you? You are literally nothing. She snapped her fingers at the catering manager, a sweaty man named Henderson, who had just sprinted over looking like he was about to faint. Fire her. Right now. I want her blacklisted from every single agency in Manhattan. Make sure she starves. Henderson nodded so fast his neck looked like it might snap. Yes, Miss Vanveer. Instantly. He turned to Sophie, his eyes cold and terrified. Get out. Leave the uniform by the dumpsters. You're done. Sophie felt the hot prickle of tears, but she bit the inside of her cheek. She was not going to cry in front of these vultures. I'm leaving, she said flatly. She looked back down at the old woman, giving her wrinkled hand a gentle, reassuring squeeze. Are you going to be okay, ma'am? Can I help you find the door? Before the woman could even speak, Richard grabbed Sophie roughly by the bicep. You heard the lady. Get out before I have the cops haul you away for assault. Sophie violently yanked her arm out of his grip. She gave the old woman one last, desperate look. Be safe, she whispered. Then, keeping her chin up despite the blood and the crushing humiliation, Sophie O'Connell turned and marched out of the ballroom. She left behind her gig, her pride, and her only way to keep her brother alive. What she didn't see was the old woman watching her walk away. The fear had totally vanished from the elderly woman's dark eyes, replaced by a terrifying, cold calculation. She casually reached into her worn leather purse. Not for a tissue, but for a sleek, encrypted smartphone. She dialed one number. Lorenzo, she said, her voice suddenly steady as a rock. Come get me. And bring the convoy. The walk to the lonely bus stop was a miserable blur of freezing rain and harsh streetlights. New York City doesn't care if your life just fell apart, it only cares if you're in the way. Sophie collapsed onto the cracked plastic bench of the shelter, shivering violently in her thin street clothes. She was pressing a handful of scratchy napkins she'd grabbed from a hot dog cart against her bleeding cheek. The cut was deep, and a nasty, mottled purple bruise was already swelling under her eye. Stupid, she sobbed to herself, her breath turning to white mist in the freezing air. So stupid. How are we going to pay for the insulin now? Her cheap phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from her scumbag landlord. Rent due tomorrow by noon. 0 exceptions. She dropped her head into her hands. She was only 24, but tonight, she felt 80. The bus was insanely late. Long Island Transit always was. The street was totally dead, completely isolated from the glowing mansions of the wealthy enclave. Suddenly, headlights washed over the wet asphalt. Blindingly bright. Sophie squinted, standing up with a sliver of hope. But it wasn't a bus. 3 massive, matte black SUVs rolled silently up to the curb, moving in perfect, lethal synchronization like a pod of killer whales. They aggressively angled their bumpers, completely boxing in the bus stop. Sophie's heart kicked into overdrive. She backed up until her shoulders hit the cold G. Lass of the shelter. Was this the cops? Did Beatrice actually press charges? The doors of the lead and rear vehicles popped open. Literal giants in tailored charcoal suits stepped out, the fabric straining against their massive shoulders. They all wore discreet earpieces and completely deadpan expressions. Then, the door of the middle SUV opened. The man who stepped out was cut from a totally different cloth. He didn't look like a bodyguard, he looked like the guy who bought and sold bodyguards for fun. He was toweringly tall, with hair as black as pitch and eyes the color of cracked glacier ice. He wore a heavy wool overcoat, the collar flipped up against the biting wind. His face was sharp, aristocratic, and devastatingly handsome, but in a terrifying way. Like looking at a beautiful loaded gun. Sophie didn't know the name Lorenzo Valente. But she recognized pure, unfiltered power when it walked toward her. Every step he took was slow, measured, and entirely predatory. He stopped exactly 3 feet away. His icy eyes flicked down to the bloody napkin in her trembling hand, dragged down to her soaked, scuffed sneakers, and snapped back up to meet her terrified gaze. Sophie O'Connell. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone. It sounded like expensive scotch poured over crushed glass. Who's asking? Sophie stammered, hating how small her voice sounded. I am. He closed the distance. You were working at the Van Veer estate tonight. I didn't steal anything. Sophie blurted, her panic spiking. If she told the cops I hit her, she's totally lying. The whole room saw it. Lorenzo tilted his head, his expression completely unreadable. I know exactly what happened. He slowly raised his hand. Sophie violently flinched, squeezing her eyes shut and bracing for another hit. But instead, she felt warm, calloused fingers gently brush against her chin. He tilted her face toward the streetlight, his eyes narrowing at the ugly purple swelling. His touch was clinical, yet surprisingly gentle. She hit you hard, he murmured. It wasn't a question. It sounded like a coroner observing a crime scene. With a ring? He dropped his hand and reached inside his coat. Sophie held her breath, but he just pulled out a pristine, monogrammed white handkerchief and held it out to her. For the blood, he commanded softly. Sophie took it, her fingers brushing his. Who are you? My name is Lorenzo Valente. And the woman you threw yourself in front of tonight was my mother. All the air rushed right out of Sophie's lungs. The fragile, sweet old lady with the cheap purse? That was the mother of this terrifying mob boss? Oh my God, Sophie whispered. Is she okay? For a fraction of a second, the ice in Lorenzo's eyes melted. She is understandably shaken. But she is physically unharmed. He stepped back and casually gestured to the open door of his armored SUV. Because of you. Get in. Wait, what? Sophie glued her feet to the pavement. No way. I'm waiting for the Q4 bus. The bus isn't coming, Lorenzo stated flatly. I bought the regional transit company 10 minutes ago and canceled the route so we wouldn't be interrupted. Sophie just stared at him, her brain short-circuiting. You're kidding. I don't joke, he replied, deadpan. But realistically, the bus broke down 3 miles back. Get in the car, Sophie. I am not getting in a car with a strange man. Look at you. She waved a hand at the terrifying convoy. You're clearly dangerous. The ghost of a smirk finally touched the corner of his mouth. I am incredibly dangerous. But never to you. You took a blow that was meant for my family. In my world, that creates a blood debt. And the Valentes always settle their debts. I don't want your money, Sophie shot back, her stubborn pride finally waking up. I just did what any decent human would do. I am well aware, Lorenzo said softly. Which is exactly why you are coming with me. Beatrice Van Veer fired you. She blacklisted you from the industry. You have a brother, Tobias, whose pancreas is failing. You have rent due tomorrow. You have absolutely nothing. A cold chill ran down Sophie's spine. How do you know Toby's name? I know everything. Lorenzo stepped so close she could smell his cologne, sandalwood, and a sharp hint of gunpowder. Come with me. I have a real job for you. A place where absolutely no one will ever lay a hand on you again. He slowly turned his head, glaring back toward the glowing Van Veer mansion in the distance. The ice in his eyes turned into a blazing black fire. They broke something incredibly precious to me tonight. They have absolutely no idea what kind of hell is coming for them. He held out his large, scarred hand. Come, Sophie. Let me balance the scales. Sophie looked at the dark, empty street. She looked down at the bloody napkin. She pictured Toby, pale and shaking, cutting his insulin doses in half to save a few bucks. And then she pictured Beatrice's smug, hateful sneer. Without another word, Sophie O'Connell placed her small hand in Lorenzo Valente's. The ride to his estate was completely silent, but it wasn't awkward. The heavy air was filled with the low purr of the V8 engine and the scent of that intoxicating cologne. They didn't head toward the city. Instead, the convoy pushed deep into the North Shore, deep into old money territory. But unlike the loud, showy Van Veer mansion, the Valente estate was hidden behind towering, imposing iron gates and dense, shadowy forests. Where are we? Sophie asked, staring out the tinted glass. Safe, was Lorenzo's only reply. The convoy stopped in front of a sprawling, Gothic stone mansion that looked less like a house and more like a billionaire's fortress. The second the tires stopped, men in dark suits swarmed the driveway. Lorenzo stepped out and offered his hand. This time, Sophie took it willingly, her legs feeling like absolute jelly. Inside, the mansion was a cavern of polished marble and rich mahogany. It was stunning, but it felt cold, like a museum where you'd be shot for touching the art. Lorenzo. A voice echoed through the massive foyer. Maria Valente, the sweet old woman from the party, hurried down the grand staircase. She had swapped her ruined dress for a plush cashmere robe. She didn't look like a lost victim anymore, she looked like a queen, even with her red-rimmed eyes. Mama. Lorenzo's entire demeanor instantly shifted. The terrifying mob boss vanished, replaced by a fiercely devoted son. He gently kissed both of her cheeks. You should be in bed. I couldn't sleep, Maria scolded lightly, immediately shifting her focus to Sophie. I was worried sick about her. Maria hurried over, her soft hands gently cupping Sophie's battered face. Oh, sweet girl, look at this. You took this strike from me. A total stranger. I couldn't just stand there and watch her hit you, Sophie mumbled, blushing under the intense spotlight. It was wrong. You have a profoundly good heart, Maria said softly. She turned a stern glare on her towering son. Lorenzo. You will fix this. That venomous woman ruined this poor girl's life because of me. It is already being handled, Mama, Lorenzo said smoothly, his eyes locking onto Sophie's. Miss O'Connell, come to my study. We need to talk business. Sophie nervously followed him down an endless hallway lined with terrifying oil portraits of men who looked exactly like Lorenzo. The study smelled richly of old books and cigar smoke. Lorenzo bypassed a massive mahogany desk and gestured for Sophie to take one of the plush leather chairs. He didn't mince words. He slid a thick manila folder across the desk. What is this? Sophie asked. Your old life, Lorenzo said. Or rather, the radioactive crater left of it. Sophie flipped the folder open. It was a printed email blast sent from the Vanveer legal team to every high-end staffing agency in the state. It viciously accused Sophie of grand larceny, violent assault, and heavy narcotic use. It was a total, bold-faced lie. A nuclear strike on her livelihood. She lied. Sophie gasped, panic rising in her throat. Drugs? I've never touched a drug in my life. I have to take care of Toby. The truth is totally irrelevant, Lorenzo said, steepling his fingers. In her world, truth is just something you buy. Beatrice has more money, so her version becomes reality. You will never, ever work in domestic service again. You will be homeless by Friday. Sophie slammed the folder shut, feeling physically nauseous. Why are you doing this? Just to rub it in that my life is over? No, Lorenzo said, his voice dropping an octave. To show you that all your other doors are permanently closed. Which makes my door the only one that matters. He pulled a crisp legal document from a drawer and set it in front of her. My mother requires a dedicated companion. Not a nurse, I have the best doctors on payroll. Not a maid, we employ a full staff. She needs someone she actually likes. Someone who sees her as a human being, not just the Don's mother. You made her feel safe. Sophie scanned the contract. The salary printed on page 2 actually made her dizzy. It was more cash in a single month than she made working 3 jobs in a year. If you take this position, Lorenzo continued, you live here. You travel with my mother. You ensure no one ever disrespects her again. In return, you get that salary. You get my absolute, uncompromising protection. He leaned forward, his icy eyes pinning her to the chair. And I have already pulled the strings to transfer Tobias to the VIP specialist wing at St. Jude's. His insulin, his experimental treatments, his college tuition. All of it, fully paid. Sophie stopped breathing. St. Jude's was the Holy Grail. It was the place she used to cry herself to sleep wishing she could afford. You would really do that, she whispered, tears finally spilling over. Just because I took a slap? You demonstrated unbreakable loyalty, Lorenzo said intensely. And loyalty is the absolute only currency I care about. You bled for him. Why family? Now, I shield yours. He stood up, walking over to the heavy velvet curtains and staring out into the pitch-black woods. But you need to know who I am. Men don't command private armies and buy bus routes with clean money. I am a man who maintains order in the shadows. They call it organized crime. I call it necessary governance. If you sign that paper, you are under my roof. My family has vicious enemies. You will be perfectly safe, but you will be in the underworld. There is zero going back. He turned to face her. Walk out that door and fight Beatrice's corporate lawyers on your own. Or sign the paper, and let me be your monster. Sophie stared at the dotted line. She thought of Toby's hollow cheeks. She thought of Beatrice laughing as she threw her out like garbage. She picked up the heavy, gold fountain pen. I'm in, she said, signing her name. Lorenzo watched the ink dry. A dark, fiercely possessive shadow crossed his face. Good, he murmured. Welcome home, Sophie. 3 days later, Sophie's entire universe had flipped upside down, though the rest of New York was just about to catch up. She had moved into a suite at the Valente estate that was bigger than her entire apartment building, complete with a balcony overlooking a private botanical garden. Toby had been airlifted to St. Jude's within 2 hours of her signing that paper. He had FaceTimed her, sobbing happy tears because a doctor was finally taking his pain seriously. Sophie spent her days drinking imported tea and arranging fresh lilies with Maria in the sunroom. She learned the terrifying mob matriarch was actually just a sweet woman who deeply missed the olive groves of Sicily. But beneath the peaceful surface, Sophie could feel the massive storm Lorenzo was brewing. He was like a ghost, moving silently through the mansion at odd hours, always on his encrypted phone, speaking rapid-fire Italian in a tone that made the hair on Sophie's arms stand up. The first tactical strike landed on a random Tuesday. Sophie was reading a novel out loud to Maria when the heavy library doors swung open. Lorenzo strolled in, wearing a bespoke three-piece suit, looking like an apex predator in a tailored disguise. "Turn on the television," he ordered softly. Maria grabbed the remote. The screen flashed to a breaking news alert on the financial network. The blood-red ticker at the bottom screamed, "Van Veer shipping stock plummets amid massive fraud raid." Sophie gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. A frantic reporter was standing outside the towering Van Veer headquarters in Manhattan. "Absolute chaos on Wall Street today. An anonymous whistleblower has handed federal investigators a mountain of evidence exposing billions in unpaid tariffs and phantom shipping vessels. The stock is in freefall. Trading has been totally suspended." The camera aggressively cut to Richard Sterling, Beatrice's smarmy fiancé, sweating profusely as he violently shoved a cameraman out of his way. "No comment." "We are cooperating," he shrieked. Lorenzo stood perfectly still, swirling a crystal glass of amber scotch. "Did you do this?" Sophie asked, wide-eyed. "I didn't forge his signatures," Lorenzo replied dryly. "Richard Sterling has been aggressively cooking their books for 3 years to cover massive illegal gambling debts. I simply made sure the SEC found the correct hard drives." "But what about Beatrice?" Sophie started. "Keep watching," Lorenzo commanded. The broadcast abruptly cut to a live feed from a wildly expensive charity luncheon. It was the exact gala Beatrice had been obnoxiously hyping up on Instagram all week. The camera zoomed in on Beatrice, draped in bright pink Chanel, tapping the microphone to give a speech. Suddenly, 2 massive guys wearing navy windbreakers with yellow FBI lettering stormed the stage. The crowd gasped collectively. Beatrice looked furious, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at them. The lead agent didn't even blink. He grabbed her wrist, spun around, and violently slapped steel handcuffs on her. "Santa Maria!" Maria gasped, crossing herself. "They're arresting her on live television." "Obstruction of justice," Lorenzo noted, taking a slow sip of his scotch. "And massive complicity in wire fraud. Richard used her personal trust funds to launder the cash. I'm sure she's way too stupid to understand forensic accounting, but federal judges don't accept stupidity as a defense." On the massive screen, Beatrice was hysterically screaming, her expensive mascara running down her face as she was literally frog-marched off the stage in front of every socialite in New York. It was total, catastrophic humiliation. Sophie felt a dizzying mix of absolute shock and a very dark, deeply satisfying thrill. "Is it over?" Sophie whispered. Lorenzo actually chuckled. It was a dark, chilling sound. He walked over, placing his large hand on the back of her chair and leaning down until his lips were inches from her ear. "The end?" "Sophie, this is barely the prologue. She took your dignity, so I deleted her reputation. Now, I take her entire legacy." He stood up, adjusting his cuffs. "Go get dressed. No uniform. Wear the box on your bed. We are going out." "Where?" Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs. "The Van Veer Board of Directors is holding a desperate emergency meeting at the Plaza Hotel tonight to try and liquidate their assets before they go to prison," Lorenzo said. "Why are we going?" Lorenzo smiled, and for the first time, it reached his ice-blue eyes. It was utterly terrifying. Because, Mia Cara, I am the one buying their debt. And I want you standing right beside me when I rip the roof off over their heads. An hour later, Sophie looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the reflection. Lorenzo had bought her a midnight blue silk gown that clung to her curves and cascaded to the floor. She looked like absolute royalty. When they walked into the opulent lobby of the Plaza Hotel, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. It wasn't just because they looked incredible together. Lorenzo radiated an aura of pure, lethal dominance that forced people to step out of his way. They took the private elevator straight to the penthouse. A massive security guard blocked the double doors. Closed meeting. VIPs only. One of Lorenzo's shadowy men leaned in and whispered exactly 5 words into the guard's ear. The guard turned the color of chalk, swallowed hard, and practically threw the doors open. The boardroom was a war zone of screaming, chain-smoking old men. At the head of the long mahogany table sat William Vanveer, Beatrice's father. He looked like he'd aged 20 years since the party. Beatrice was slumped in a corner chair, out on a massive bail bond, her eyes swollen shut from crying as she aggressively swigged from a vodka bottle. The second Lorenzo's custom leather shoes clicked against the hardwood, the shouting stopped dead. "Who the hell are you?" William barked, slamming his hands on the table. "Security." Lorenzo strolled into the room, bringing Sophie with him. "I am the only reason any of you are still breathing free air," Lorenzo said, his voice easily commanding the cavernous room. Beatrice looked up. Her bloodshot eyes zeroed in on Sophie, and her jaw dropped. "You," she screeched, launching out of her chair. "The catering rat. You brought the maid? Dad, have her arrested. She assaulted me." "Sit down, Beatrice," Lorenzo ordered. He didn't raise his voice, but the sheer menace in the command hit like a physical blow. Beatrice froze in her tracks, suddenly realizing she was in the presence of an apex predator. Lorenzo completely ignored her, locking eyes with her sweating father. "Mr. Vanveer. I am Lorenzo Valente. I understand you are desperately seeking a $300 million liquidity injection to avoid total bankruptcy at 9 a.m. tomorrow." William slumped into his chair. "Valente? The syndicate boss?" "The venture capitalist," Lorenzo corrected. Smoothly. He tossed a massive leather binder onto the polished table. It slid perfectly, stopping inches from William's shaking hands. "I have officially purchased your entire outstanding debt portfolio from the federal banks. All of it." Lorenzo leaned over the table. "You do not owe the government a dime. You owe me." "What do you want?" William choked out. "Everything. The shipping fleet. The international routes. And the Long Island estate. You can't take the house." Beatrice screamed, her voice cracking. "That is my family's legacy." Lorenzo slowly turned to look at the ruined socialite. He reached out and wrapped his strong arm firmly around Sophie's waist, pulling her flush against his side. It was an unmistakable claim. "Actually," Lorenzo purred, a cruel, satisfied smirk playing on his lips, "I think it will make a fantastic summer home for Sophie. She mentioned she liked the crown molding. Though, obviously, we'll be firing the entire staff." Beatrice literally stopped breathing. She stared in pure horror at Sophie, the poor, exhausted girl she had tried to destroy for sport, now dripping in luxury, fiercely protected by the most dangerous man in the hemisphere. Sophie looked back at Beatrice, and the realization finally hit her. Lorenzo wasn't just getting revenge. He was rewriting the entire hierarchy of the world. "You have exactly until midnight to sign the transfer deeds," Lorenzo told William. "Or I call in the massive debt, and you die in federal prison for the ghost ships my team uncovered. The choice is yours." He turned on his heel, keeping Sophie tucked tightly against him. "Wait." Beatrice sobbed, desperately running forward. "Please. This isn't fair." Lorenzo stopped at the door. He didn't even bother looking over his shoulder. "Fairness is a bedtime story for children, Beatrice. You should have learned that before you raised your hand to a helpless old woman. He pushed the doors open. Come, Sophie. Let's get dinner. I know a fantastic spot. For beluga caviar, and they never spill. As the heavy doors clicked shut, cutting off the sounds of the Van Veer family completely imploding, Sophie looked up at the giant beside her. Did you seriously just buy a multi-million-dollar mansion out of spite? I bought their entire existence, Sophie, Lorenzo corrected softly. For you. 2 weeks later, the Van Veer empire was practically dust in the wind. It was a brutal, slow-motion train wreck that the tabloids fed on like vultures. Paparazzi caught Beatrice pawning her designer bags for cash. Her father faked a heart attack to hide in a private clinic and dodge federal subpoenas. But inside the fortified walls of the Valente estate, things were weirdly domestic. Sophie wasn't just an employee anymore. She had become the very heartbeat of the giant, cold house. She was sitting in the sunroom, watching Toby absolutely destroy a cheeseburger. The kid looked incredible. His skin had color, he had gained weight, and he was actually laughing at a YouTube video on his brand new iPad. This place is crazy, Soph, Toby mumbled around a mouthful of fries. The doctors at St. Jude's actually treat me like a human. They listen. I'm so glad, buddy, Sophie smiled, though her heart was doing complicated gymnastics. Oh, Mr. Valente stopped by my room yesterday, Toby added casually. Sophie froze dead in her tracks. He did what? Yeah, he brought me this crazy expensive marble chess set. Said I needed to learn how to think 10 steps ahead. We played a game. He smoked me in 4 moves, but then he sat there and taught me the counter-defense. Sophie felt her cheeks catch fire. Lorenzo Valente, the man who evaporated billionaire dynasties before breakfast, was hanging out in pediatric wards playing board games with her teenage brother. It was so incredibly confusing, totally dangerous, and it made her chest ache in a way she didn't want to admit. Later that night, Sophie found Lorenzo standing alone on the stone terrace. He was smoking a thick cigar, staring out into the dark tree line. He was wearing a crisp white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, exposing thick, corded forearms covered in faded, violent scars, the roadmap of a terrifying life she couldn't even begin to understand. You visited Toby, she said softly, stepping into the moonlight. Lorenzo glanced over his shoulder. The boy is incredibly smart. It is a mathematical tragedy to let a brain like that rot in an underfunded public school. You've done so much, Sophie whispered, stepping up to the stone railing beside him. The hospital, the lawyers, the house. I feel like I owe you my life. Lorenzo aggressively stamped out the cigar. He turned fully to face her, closing the distance between them until she had to tilt her head back to look at him. You owe me nothing, he said, his voice a low rumble. You brought oxygen into this house, Sophie. My mother hasn't laughed since my father was gunned down. That is a debt I can never repay with money. He lifted his hand. The air between them suddenly felt charged with 1,000,000 volts of static electricity. He gently traced the line of her jawline with his thumb, right where the ugly bruise had finally faded into nothing. And you? Sophie breathed, her heart hammering frantically. Do you ever laugh? I am currently trying to relearn how, he murmured, his gaze dropping heavily to her lips. Sophie's breath hitched. She instinctively leaned forward, closing her eyes. Bzzz. Bzzz. The harsh, violent vibration of an encrypted cell phone totally shattered the spell. Lorenzo flinched back like he'd been burned, the icy, terrifying mask of the Mafia Don slamming instantly back over his features. He yanked the phone out, his jaw clenching as he read the caller ID. I have to handle this, he said coldly, completely withdrawing. Go inside, Sophie. Lock your door. Sophie nodded numbly, wrapping her arms around herself as she hurried back inside, completely missing the absolute agony that flashed across Lorenzo's eyes as he watched her walk away. Meanwhile, deep in a trashy, mildew-scented motel in Queens, Richard Sterling was aggressively pacing the stained carpet. The room was a disaster. Beatrice was totally blacked out on the lumpy mattress, snoring next to an empty handle of cheap vodka. The high society princess had completely shattered. But Richard? Richard was backed into a corner, and cornered animals are wildly dangerous. Richard stopped pacing and glared at the massive, bald man sitting in the plastic armchair. The guy was casually cleaning his fingernails with a serrated switchblade. A massive scorpion tattoo crawled up the side of his thick neck. "You said you could fix this," Richard hissed, sweating profusely. "I've been waiting for 3 days, Victor." Victor Moretti lazily flicked the knife shut. He was a high-ranking lieutenant for the Russo Syndicate, Lorenzo's absolute most hated, blood-soaked rivals. The Russos had been violently trying to carve out pieces of Valente territory for a decade, but Lorenzo was always 5 steps ahead. "I said I would listen to your pitch," Victor corrected, his voice sounding like a cement mixer. "You bring me absolutely nothing, Sterling. Your bank accounts are frozen. Your girl is a junkie. Why the hell should the Rue so stick our necks out for you? Because I know exactly how to gut Lorenzo Valente." Richard spat, his eyes wide and manic. Victor paused. "Valente doesn't have weaknesses. He's a Terminator." "He does now," Richard smiled, a sick, ugly grin. "A girl. A literal nobody catering waitress named Sophie O'Connell. She moved into his fortress. He bought my fiancée's multi-million-dollar estate just to hand her the keys as a joke. I saw the way he looked at her at the plaza. He is totally obsessed." Victor slowly sat forward. "He moved a civilian into the main compound?" "Yes. And she actually leaves," Richard said frantically. "She takes a company SUV to St. Jude's every single Tuesday to visit her sick brother. Minimal security detail because Valente thinks nobody knows she exists." Victor smiled, revealing a row of gold teeth. "So, we take the girl." "Exactly," Richard said eagerly. "You take her, you hold her hostage, and you force Valente to hand over the Port Authority and the shipping routes." "And what exactly is your cut, prep school?" Victor sneered. $5 million in untraceable cash," Richard demanded. "And I want to be the one to call Beatrice and tell her that the little rat who ruined her life is dead." Victor popped the switchblade open again. "Deal. Tomorrow is Tuesday. We'll be ready." Tuesday morning felt wrong from the second Sophie woke up. The sky over New York was a bruised, heavy gray, and the humidity felt like a wet wool blanket. As Sophie grabbed her purse to leave for the hospital, a weird knot of dread twisted in her stomach. "Do you want me to ride with you, honey?" Maria asked, noticing Sophie hesitating by the massive front doors. "No, I'm okay," Sophie forced a smile. "You have your poker game with the ladies. Rocco and Sal are driving me in the armored truck. I'll be totally fine." "Give my sweet Toby a hug," Maria said, kissing her cheek. "Tell him I am making my special baked ziti for his visit this weekend." Sophie walked out to the mod. Sive, bulletproof SUV idling in the driveway. Rocco and Sal were Valente veterans, massive, terrifying men who always treated Sophie like absolute royalty. "Straight to St. Jude's, Miss Sophie?" Rocco asked, adjusting his sidearm. "Yes, please, Rocco." "Thank you." The drive was totally routine until they hit a narrow, grimy underpass in Queens. Heavy construction had squeezed the road down to a single lane flanked by concrete barriers. "I hate this absolute garbage city," Sal grumbled from the passenger seat, his eyes nervously scanning the mirrors. Suddenly, a massive box truck directly in front of them slammed hard on its air brakes. Rocco reacted with lightning speed, burying the brake pedal. The heavy SUV violently skidded on the wet asphalt, stopping inches from a devastating crash. "What is this idiot doing?" Rocco roared, instantly throwing the truck into reverse. But before the tires could spin, a beat-up panel van aggressively screeched up right on their rear bumper, completely wedging them in. "Ambush!" Rocco screamed, ripping his heavy pistol from his shoulder holster. "Get down, Miss Sophie." "Floor." It all happened in less than 5 seconds. The back doors of the van kicked open. Four massive men wearing black ski masks and tactical vests flooded out, raising fully automatic assault rifles. They didn't aim at the passengers, the glass was totally bulletproof. Instead, they mercilessly sprayed the tires, blowing out all four heavy run-flats in a deafening barrage of gunfire. Then, one of the shooters sprinted forward and slapped a square patch of C4 explosive directly onto the passenger window. "Brace!" Sal yelled. Boom! The shaped charge blew the bulletproof glass violently inward. Sal screamed in agony as shrapnel shredded his arm, but he still managed to blindly fire 2 shots out the hole before a rifle but brutally cracked him across the skull, knocking him out cold. The door was violently ripped open. A massive, gloved hand clamped around Sophie's arm. "Let me go," she screamed, thrashing wildly and kicking the man directly in the knee. He didn't even blink. He dragged her kicking and screaming out into the freezing rain. "Grab the package." "Let's move," one of the shooters barked over the sirens. Sophie scrambled to her feet, but someone violently shoved a heavy canvas bag over her head, plunging her into total, suffocating darkness. She felt a sharp, cold pinch in her neck. "Night-night, princess," a raspy voice whispered. The world violently tilted, and the last thing Sophie heard before she completely blacked out was the terrifying squeal of tires leaving the smoking wreckage of the Valente SUV behind. An hour later, inside the Valente compound, Lorenzo was running a high-level syndicate meeting when a specific, piercing ringtone cut through the room. It was the red line. The absolute emergency burner. The entire room went graveyard silent. Lorenzo picked up the phone. He listened for exactly 10 seconds. He didn't yell. He didn't smash the phone. His face remained perfectly, terrifyingly blank. But the temperature in the room literally felt like it plunged below freezing. His eyes turned into endless, black voids. "Is she breathing?" Lorenzo asked, his voice dead flat. He listened to the frantic voice of a bleeding Rocco on the other end. "If she has a single scratch on her skin," Lorenzo whispered, "I will personally peel the flesh from your bones while you watch." He hung up the phone. He stood up slowly. His capos, men who had literally survived gang wars and federal prison, visibly shrank back in their leather chairs. They had all seen Lorenzo angry. This was not anger. This was the terrifying, silent calm right before a nuclear detonation. "Boss," his right-hand man, Luca, asked, his voice trembling. "They took her," Lorenzo stated flatly. He casually walked over to a hidden wall safe, punched in a sequence, and ripped the heavy steel door open. He pulled out a Kevlar vest and 2 massive, custom silver 911 handguns. "Who?" Luca asked, already unholstering his own weapon. "Victor Moretti. And that sniveling little rat, Richard Sterling." Lorenzo racked the slide of his pistol. "CHK. They want to trade for the shipping docks." He turned to face his men. "Activate everyone. Pull the crews from Jersey. Pull the hitters from the Bronx. I want every single soldier we have armed and on the streets in exactly 20 minutes. One of the older, gray-haired capos nervously cleared his throat. "Boss, with respect, we're launching a full syndicate war over a civilian girl." Lorenzo stopped dead in his tracks. He slowly turned his head, his eyes boring a hole straight through the old man's skull. "No," Lorenzo said, his voice echoing like thunder. "We are launching a war for my future wife." The room collectively stopped breathing. "Burn this city to the ground," Lorenzo ordered. "Find out what hole they dragged her into, and butcher every single breathing soul who stands in your way." Sophie woke up choking on the smell of rust, mold, and salt water. Her head was absolutely pounding. She blinked aggressively, her vision swimming into focus. She was forcefully tied to a metal chair in the center of a massive, decaying warehouse. "Welcome back to the real world," a voice mocked. Standing 10 feet away was Richard Sterling. He looked absolutely unhinged. His designer shirt was stained with nervous sweat, and his hands were physically shaking. Richard? Sophie gasped, pulling against the heavy zip ties cutting into her wrists. Are you insane? Why are you doing this? Richard let out a manic, high-pitched laugh. Why? Look at my life. I had millions. I had status. And you pathetic little catering rat, you took it all away from me. You literally committed federal fraud. Sophie yelled back, her fear being rapidly replaced by pure anger. You destroyed your own life. Richard stepped forward and violently slapped her across the face. It stung fiercely, but after everything she'd been through, it felt pathetic. Shut your mouth. Richard screamed, spittle flying from his lips. You are nothing but bait. When your psycho boyfriend walks through those doors, we are going to blow his brains out, and then I am going to leave you chained to that chair for the rats. A massive shadow stepped out from behind a stack of rusted shipping crates. Victor Moretti casually strolled into the light, looking at Sophie like she was a piece of meat. She's pretty, Victor grunted. Valente has good taste. It's a real shame. He checked his heavy gold watch. He got the ransom message. The arrogant prick should be calling to beg for terms any second now. Sophie looked at the two men. Her heart was beating out of her chest, but then she remembered the look in Lorenzo's eyes when he talked about his family. She remembered how he crushed a billionaire dynasty just because they hurt her feelings. He's not going to negotiate, Sophie said softly, a dark smile touching her lips. Richard frowned. What did you say? I said he won't negotiate, Sophie repeated, staring Richard dead in the eyes. You honestly think you kidnapped a wealthy businessman's girlfriend? You idiot. You kidnapped the only thing keeping the devil on a leash. And now that I'm chained up in here, there is absolutely nothing holding him back. Exactly as she finished the sentence, the overhead halogen lights flickered violently and completely died. Pitch black. Then, a sound erupted from outside. It wasn't police sirens. It wasn't the sound of tires squealing. It was the terrifying, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of a heavy-caliber military machine gun completely shredding the corrugated steel doors of the warehouse. Bright red laser sights sliced through the dusty darkness like lightsabers. The devil hadn't just arrived, he brought hell with him. The front wall of the warehouse literally disintegrated under the barrage of bullets. In the absolute chaos of blinding muzzle flashes and aiming men, Lorenzo moved like the Grim Reaper. He didn't duck. He didn't hide. Every single time his silver 1911 cracked, a Russo Syndicate member dropped completely dead. Victor Moretti roared, raising his weapon, but he didn't even get to pull the trigger. Lorenzo put 2 bullets perfectly through his chest before the giant man could even exhale, his grand ambitions choking out in a pool of his own blood. Richard Sterling completely lost his mind. He dropped to his knees, scurrying backward like a crab into the corner, openly weeping and holding his shaking hands in the air. Wait! Wait! It was just business. I can fix this. Please. Lorenzo casually stepped over Victor's corpse, seamlessly dropping the empty magazine from his gun and slapping a fresh one in. He didn't even bother looking down at Richard. Luca, Lorenzo said calmly, not breaking his stride. Take out the garbage. As a terrifying mobster dragged the violently sobbing Richard away into the shadows by his hair, Lorenzo finally dropped to his knees right in front of Sophie. His hands that had just effortlessly ended a dozen lives without a flinch, were physically shaking as he pulled a knife to slice the thick zip ties off her raw wrists. I thought. Sophie broke down, instantly throwing her arms around his neck and burying her face in his tactical vest. The overpowering smell of sandalwood and burnt gunpowder flooded her senses, and she had never felt safer in her entire life. Never, Lorenzo fiercely whispered into her hair, wrapping his massive arms around her and lifting her entirely out of the chair like she weighed nothing. I would physically tear the stars out of the sky before I let anyone take you from me. 6 months later, the sprawling Van Veer estate officially had a new name chiseled into the iron gates, Villa Sofia. The gardens were exploding with color, completely erasing the cold, sterile memory of the people who used to live there. Beatrice was currently crying in a fader. Al prison cell, serving a mandatory 5-year sentence. Her father was totally broke and completely forgotten by high society. But here, on the sunny terrace, there was absolutely nothing but light. Sophie stood on the balcony, wearing a flowing white sundress, smiling brightly as she watched Toby sprinting across the manicured lawn, chasing a wildly energetic golden retriever puppy. His laughter echoed through the warm summer air. She felt the familiar, comforting heat of Lorenzo stepping up behind her. He wrapped his strong arms firmly around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He reached over her shoulder and placed a small, black velvet box onto the stone railing. He popped it open. Inside rested a flawless diamond that made the jagged ring Beatrice had hit her with look like a cheap toy out of a gumball machine. "You stepped in front of my mother," Lorenzo murmured, his lips brushing the exact spot on her cheek where the bruise used to be. "And in doing so, you completely saved my soul. Will you do me the absolute honor of letting me spend the rest of my life repaying that debt?" Sophie spun around in his arms, happy tears stinging her eyes. She didn't see a terrifying syndicate boss. She didn't see a monster. She just saw the man who burned the world down to keep her warm. "Yes," she whispered, pulling him down for a kiss. "Forever." And that is the insanely dramatic story of Sophie and Lorenzo. From a single, cruel slap at an elite party to a massive love story forged in fire, blood, and diamonds, it just goes to show you that sometimes the absolute worst moments in our lives are just the opening scenes to a destiny we couldn't possibly imagine. Sophie didn't just find a way to pay the rent that night. She found a fierce family, an incredible future, and a man willing to literally go to war for her. What did you guys think? Did Richard and Beatrice absolutely get the karma they deserved, or do you think Lorenzo took his brutal revenge a little too far? I want to hear all your thoughts, so drop a comment down below. I read every single one of them.